Jonathan Mercer stood at his office window, watching the morning shift file into Copper Canyon Mine. The men moved with mechanical precision, hauling equipment, checking timbers, disappearing into the dark mouth of the earth. Not one of them looked up toward his window. Not one of them laughed. Behind him. The quarterly report sat on his polished mahogany desk. Production up 30% since his father's death, costs down 18%, profit margins that would make any businessman proud. Jonathan had transformed his inheritance into a model of efficiency. He turned from the window and caught sight of the photograph on the wall. His father, Thomas Mercer, stood surrounded by miners at a Christmas celebration from 15 years ago. Arms draped around shoulders, men grinning like they'd just struck gold. His father's face radiated warmth that had nothing to do with the bonfire blazing behind them. Jonathan's own desk held no such photographs. Clean lines, organized files, everything in its place. He grabbed his coat and headed down to the operations yard. The foreman's morning report showed another strong day ahead. Jonathan nodded his approval and walked among the workers, reviewing equipment, checking preparations. The men parted for him like water around a stone. Conversations died mid-sentence. Eyes found the ground. Young Pete Morrison fumbled his pickaxe and nearly dropped it when Jonathan approached. The boy's hands shook as he secured his gear. Efficiency. Morrison. Jonathan said, "We don't pay for fumbling." "Yes, sir." "Mr. Mercer. Won't happen again." Jonathan moved on. He passed Frank Sullivan, an old-timer who'd worked these mines for 30 years. The same Frank who used to bounce young Jonathan on his knee, who taught him to tie proper knots, who always had peppermints in his pocket for the boss's son. Frank didn't even nod, just limped past with his lunch pail, jaw set. Jonathan felt something twist in his chest. He pushed it down. Sentiment had no place in business. His father had been beloved, true. But Jonathan's numbers proved his methods worked better. Back in his office, he reviewed the wage reports. He'd streamlined everything his father had made unnecessarily complicated. No more Christmas bonuses. No family emergency fund. No promotions based on some vague notion of character rather than measurable productivity. The business ran like clockwork now. Cold, precise, profitable. Through the open window, voices drifted up from the yard below. Two miners, probably thinking they were out of earshot. "Old Thomas built this place with his heart and hands." One said, "Young Jonathan here, he just counts the coins." Aye. "The father knew every man's name, every child's birthday. The son don't even see us." Jonathan's hand tightened on his pen. The words stung more than he wanted to admit. He looked again at the photograph of his father, at those laughing faces, at the warmth that seemed to radiate from the image itself. For just a moment, his pristine office felt very cold. The note arrived with the morning mail, written in careful script on plain paper. Eleanor Hartwell requested a meeting regarding documents his father had left with her late husband, William. His father's first foreman, Jonathan nearly dismissed it. He had a mine to run, investors to satisfy, production schedules to maintain. What could some widow possibly have that mattered now? But the phrase "documents your father left" nagged at him. His father had been meticulous about records. If there were papers Jonathan didn't know about, he should see them. He sent word she could come that afternoon. Eleanor Hartwell arrived precisely at 2 o'clock. She wore simple black, her widow's weeds showing careful mending but maintained with dignity. Her hair, silver-threaded, was pulled back in a neat bun. She carried a worn leather satchel that had seen better days. Jonathan had expected someone timid, perhaps pleading. Instead, she met his eyes with quiet composure. A schoolteacher now. He remembered she'd taken over the small school after William's death 3 years ago. "Mr. Mercer, thank you for seeing me." Her voice was steady, cultured. "I've carried these longer than I should have. Your father asked William to keep them safe, to give them to you when you were ready." "Ready for what?" She set the satchel on his desk. The leather creaked as she opened it. Inside lay bundles of letters, tied with string, yellowed slightly with age. Your father wrote these over the years. Business philosophy, mostly. Thoughts about running the mine, about leadership, about what truly matters. She pulled out the first bundle. William was to give them to you after your father passed. But William died first. I've kept them, waiting for the right moment. Jonathan took the bundle, untied the string. His father's handwriting, bold and clear, filled the pages. He read the first lines of the top letter. A mine is not rocks and ore. Jonathan, it's the men who go into the dark every day, trusting their lives to timber and faith. Treat them like family, and they'll move mountains for you. Profit follows character, not the reverse. Something hot flashed through Jonathan's chest. My father was sentimental. I've proven profit comes from efficiency, not sentiment. Eleanor's expression didn't change. Have you? Your numbers are higher. Certainly. Your costs are lower. But what are you building? Mr. Mercer, a successful operation. The most productive mine in the territory. Your father built more than productivity. She placed her hands on the desk, gentle but firm. He built loyalty, trust, community. These men and their families, that was your inheritance. Not just the mines and equipment. The responsibility for lives, for dignity, for treating people as more than tools. Jonathan felt his defenses rising. The world has changed. Business requires nothing. Eleanor interrupted, her voice still soft but carrying steel. Men require business to serve them, not the other way around. Your father understood that. He left you more than a mine. Mr. Mercer, he left you a legacy of character. These letters explain what that means. She stepped back from the desk. Read them. Or don't. But they're yours now. What you do with them is your choice. She moved toward the door, then paused. Your father was a great man, not because he was wealthy, because he made wealth serve goodness. There's a difference. After she left, Jonathan sat staring at the letters. The afternoon sun slanted through the window, catching dust motes in its beam. Outside, the mine operations continued their efficient rhythm. He picked up another letter, almost against his will, and began to read. Jonathan couldn't stop reading. He worked through the evening. Through dinner he forgot to eat. Into the deep night when the mine fell silent and lamplight was all that kept the darkness back. The letters revealed a father he'd misunderstood. Young Jonathan had watched Thomas Mercer work 16-hour days and assumed it was ambition driving him. He'd heard his father discuss costs and profits and thought the business itself was the point. He'd been wrong about everything. One memory surfaced with painful clarity. Jonathan was 12, watching his father talk with a miner whose wife had fallen ill. Thomas had pressed money into the man's hand, sent him home for the week, told him to take care of his family first. Young Jonathan had asked later, why pay him when he's not working? His father had smiled. Because Jim Davis has given me 10 years of honest labor and never missed a day. Because his wife Mary bakes bread for the church social every month. Because their boy Tommy wants to be a miner someday. And I want him to remember that his father worked for a man who cared. That's an investment that pays dividends you can't measure on a ledger, son. But Jonathan had measured everything on ledgers. He'd learned the numbers, memorized the costs, studied the markets. When Thomas died 5 years ago, and Jonathan inherited at 28, he'd been so certain he understood what mattered. He'd immediately modernized. Cut the Christmas bonuses unnecessary expense. Eliminated the family emergency fund workers should save for themselves. Changed the promotion system to reward pure productivity rather than his father's vague notions of character and loyalty. The old-timers had protested quietly. Frank Sullivan had even tried to talk to him. Jonathan had dismissed their concerns as resistance to change, nostalgia for an outdated way of doing business. Now, holding his father's letters, Jonathan saw it differently. He'd inherited a living community and treated it like a machine. He'd received trust and replaced it with fear. He'd been given a legacy of dignity and traded it for efficiency. One letter stopped him cold, dated just 6 months before Thomas's death. Son, when I'm gone, you'll face a choice. You can run this mine like a machine, extracting maximum profit from ore and men alike. Or you can run it like a family, building something that outlasts us both. The first will make you wealthy. The second will make you worthy of the name Mercer. I pray you choose wisely. I pray I've taught you well enough to know the difference. But the choice, Jonathan, will be yours alone. Jonathan set the letter down with shaking hands. The lamplight flickered. Outside, false dawn was turning the sky gray. He'd made his choice 5 years ago. He'd chosen wrong. The admission hurt worse than he'd expected. All his pride, all his certainty about his superior methods, all his satisfaction at exceeding his father's production numbers, it all crumbled like rotten timber. He'd destroyed the real legacy. The workers who'd loved Thomas Mercer now hated his son. The community his father built had become a collection of wary strangers. The trust of 3 decades had been squandered in 5 years. Jonathan looked at the photograph on the wall, at his father's warm smile, at the men who'd treated Thomas like family. I chose wrong. He whispered to the empty room. God help me, I chose wrong. The words hung in the silence. Outside, the first shift would be arriving soon. Men who feared him rather than respected him, who worked for wages rather than purpose. He couldn't undo 5 years, but perhaps he could begin again. Perhaps it wasn't too late to honor the legacy he'd inherited. Perhaps he could learn to become worthy of the name Mercer. The next morning, Jonathan walked the mine with new eyes. Every detail his father's letters had mentioned, he now saw with terrible clarity. The worker housing Thomas had maintained so carefully, Jonathan had let it deteriorate. Roofs leaked. Porches sagged. Paint peeled in long gray strips. He'd called it teaching the men self-reliance. His father would have called it abandoning responsibility. The safety equipment told the same story. Thomas had insisted on the best, even when it cost more. Jonathan had switched to cheaper suppliers, arguing that adequate was sufficient. He watched Frank Sullivan limp across the yard, favoring his right leg. An injury from 2 weeks ago when a support beam cracked. Frank hadn't reported it, hadn't complained, just bore it silently. The old man had been hurt because Jonathan chose cheaper timber. Jonathan's stomach twisted. He'd been so proud of cutting costs. He tried to speak to Frank during the noon break. The old miner sat alone, eating bread and cheese from his pail. Frank, I wanted to ask about your family. How are they? Frank looked up, surprise flickering across his weathered face. Then wariness settled in. They're well enough, Mr. Mercer. Your daughter, she married last year. Aye. And you have grandchildren. 3 now, new one born last month. Jonathan felt the weight of his ignorance. I should have known that. Should have asked. Frank studied him with eyes that had seen 30 years of mining. 30 years of men and their motivations. Your father knew all their names. Knew when my granddaughter lost her first tooth. Knew when my grandson took his first steps. He asked because he cared, not because he was supposed to. The words landed like hammer blows. Jonathan had no response. Frank returned to his lunch. The conversation was over. That evening, Eleanor Hartwell appeared at his office door. She didn't ask permission, just walked in carrying a small basket. I brought you supper. You looked like you forgot to eat yesterday, too. Jonathan blinked. How did you... The letters? They have that effect. She set the basket on his desk. Unpacked bread, cold chicken, apple preserves. Your father nearly starved himself the first time he really understood what it meant to be responsible for other people's lives. William had to force him to eat. She pulled up a chair, settled into it with the ease of someone who wouldn't be dismissed. What have you seen today? Everything I've done wrong. The admission came easier than expected. The housing, the safety equipment, the way the men look at me like I'm a stranger, or worse, like I'm someone to fear. Your father believed profit came from character. Eleanor said, "You've been trying to generate character from profit. It doesn't work that way." "No." Jonathan looked at the photograph on the wall. "It doesn't." "So what will you do?" The question hung there. Jonathan thought about his investors, his carefully constructed systems, his pride in his efficiency. Then he thought about Frank's grandchildren, whose names he didn't know, about men working with inadequate safety equipment, about families living in houses he'd let rot. "I'm going to change everything," he said. The words terrified him. "I don't know if they'll believe me. I don't know if it's even possible after 5 years, but I have to try." Eleanor smiled. "Your father would be proud you finally understand. Now comes the hard part." "What's that, proving you mean it?" Jonathan called a meeting with his foreman the next morning. 6 men who managed the day-to-day operations, who carried out his orders, who'd watched him dismantle everything Thomas Mercer built. They filed into his office with careful faces. Jonathan had never called a meeting like this before. He conducted business through written memos, efficiency reports, productivity analyses. He stood by the window, looking out at the mine, then turned to face them. "Effective immediately. We're implementing changes. Wages increase by 20% across the board. We're purchasing new safety equipment from the suppliers my father used. The worker housing will be repaired, roofs, porches, everything. We're reinstating the family emergency fund and the Christmas bonuses." Silence. The foreman exchanged glances. Tom Bradley, the senior man, finally spoke. "What brought this on?" "Mr. Mercer." Jonathan could have lied. Could have talked about long-term investment or worker retention or productivity studies. Instead, he told the truth. "I've been reading my father's letters. Letters he left explaining how to run this mine the right way. I've been doing it the wrong way for 5 years. Learning lessons I should have learned 20 years ago. These changes are just the beginning." More silence. Then Henry Walsh, youngest of the foremen, asked, "The investors won't like this. Costs will spike. Let me worry about the investors." Jonathan met each man's eyes. "I'm asking you to help me rebuild what I tore down. I'm asking you to trust that I'm serious. I know I haven't earned that trust, but I'm going to—" Tom Bradley shifted his weight. "Your father had an open-door policy. Any man could come to him with problems, concerns, ideas. You instituted the memo system instead. Then we returned to the open-door policy." Jonathan felt like he was dismantling his own fortress, brick by brick. It was terrifying. It was necessary. Starting today, the foreman left. Still uncertain, Jonathan didn't blame them. Words were easy. Action would prove whether he meant it over the following days. Eleanor became his unexpected guide. She appeared each evening, sometimes with food he'd forgotten to eat, sometimes just to talk. She told him stories his father's letters hadn't captured. There was a cave-in 7 years ago. 3 men trapped for 16 hours. Your father shut down all operations, had every available man working the rescue. He stood at that tunnel entrance the entire time, refusing food, refusing rest. When they brought the men out alive, he wept. Then he paid full wages to everyone for the week they spent reinforcing every tunnel in the mine. "I would have calculated the cost of the shutdown," Jonathan admitted. He calculated the cost of losing men he loved. Eleanor's voice stayed gentle. "That's the difference." Jonathan found himself watching for her visits. Her wisdom steadied him. Her stories illuminated what the letters outlined. She never made him feel stupid or condemned, just helped him understand what he'd been too blind to see. One evening, as spring deepened into early summer, he asked, "Why are you helping me? I destroyed what your husband and my father built together." Eleanor looked at him with those clear, steady eyes. Because I believe people can change when they truly want to. Because your father asked William to give you these letters when you were ready. And I think you're finally ready. And because someone has to believe in you until you can believe in yourself. Her words settled into his chest, warm and frightening. He was beginning to see more than just a teacher, more than just his father's legacy keeper. He was beginning to see Eleanor, outside. The June evening stretched long and golden. Inside, something frozen in Jonathan's chest was finally starting to thaw. The changes rolled out across 2 weeks. New safety equipment arrived. Repair crews began working on the housing. Wage increases appeared in pay envelopes. The family emergency fund was reinstated with Jonathan's personal contribution to start it. The workers responded with suspicion. Jonathan had expected gratitude, or at least acknowledgement. Instead, he got wary silence. Men accepted their higher wages without comment. The repair crews worked on houses where occupants watched them like they might steal something. Tom Bradley pulled him aside after a week. They don't trust it. They think it's a trick. What kind of trick? Get them comfortable, dependent on the higher wages. Then cut everything when times get lean. Or worse, you're softening them up before you sell the operation to someone who will be even harder than you were. Jonathan felt frustration rising. I'm trying to make things right. Your father earned their trust over 30 years. Tom's voice wasn't unkind, just honest. You've earned their resentment over 5. That doesn't disappear because you read some letters and changed some policies. The real blow came during a routine inspection. Jonathan was reviewing the new timber supports when he overheard 2 miners talking behind a loaded cart. It's all show. Young Mercer don't care about us. He's trying to impress those investors. Make the place look good for a sale. My cousin works the Silver Ridge mine. Says their owner pulled the same thing right before he sold out. New owner cut wages 40% first week. Aye. Better to know where you stand with a hard man than trust a reformed one. Jonathan stood frozen. Every change he'd made, every reform he'd implemented, they saw as manipulation. The workers had learned not to trust management, and he'd been the one who taught them. Production numbers started dropping, not dramatically, but steadily. Men worked slower, more cautiously. The efficiency Jonathan had prided himself on began slipping away. His investors noticed. Letters arrived questioning his judgment, asking about the cost increases and production decreases. One threatened to pull funding if things didn't improve. The pressure came from everywhere. Workers who didn't believe him, investors who didn't understand, foremen who tried to help but couldn't bridge 5 years of damage in 2 weeks. Frank Sullivan confronted him directly one afternoon. Jonathan was checking a repair on the main shaft when the old miner approached. Jaw set, eyes hard. Need to say something. Mr. Mercer, go ahead. Frank, your father earned our trust over decades. Every day, every decision, every crisis he proved he cared. You've earned our resentment over 5 years. Every cut, every cold policy, every time you walked past us like we were equipment instead of men. Frank's voice stayed level but carried weight like falling rock. You think policy changes erase that? You think higher wages buy back what you destroyed? I'm trying. I know what you're trying. Question is whether you'll keep trying when it gets hard, when the investors pressure you, when the numbers don't work out the way you want. Your father held steady through boom and bust because he cared about us more than profit. Do you? Jonathan had no answer. Frank nodded like that confirmed something, then walked away. That night, alone in his office, Jonathan stared at the stack of investor letters. It would be so easy to revert, scale back the changes, cut costs again, return to the efficiency that had made him successful. Eleanor found him there, head in his hands. They don't believe me, he said without looking up. I've changed everything, and they think it's a trick. She didn't offer false comfort. Your father built trust brick by brick, day by day, year by year. So must you. Did you think 2 weeks would undo 5 years? I thought if I fixed the policies, Policies are easy to change. Hearts take longer. She sat across from him. The question isn't whether they trust you yet. It's whether you'll keep earning that trust even when it's hard, even when it costs you, even when you want to give up. Jonathan looked at her. What if I can't? What if I've broken this too badly to fix? Then you'll have learned the hardest lesson of all. Eleanor said quietly, that some things, once destroyed, can't be rebuilt. But I don't think you're there yet. I think you're right where transformation happens at the point where it stops being easy. Her faith in him felt unearned, but it also felt like the only thing keeping him from surrender. Jonathan hit bottom on a Thursday night inspection. He was walking through the evening shift, trying once again to connect with workers who avoided his gaze. When he passed two miners talking near the equipment shed, he wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but their voices carried. Remember when old Thomas knew every man's family? Jimmy's wife just had a baby boy last week. Young Mercer there. He don't even know Jimmy exists. That's the difference. The father saw people. The son sees profit margins. Jonathan stopped in the shadows. Stricken. Jimmy. He didn't know who Jimmy was. Didn't know about the baby. Didn't know anything except production numbers and efficiency reports. He'd changed policies, but not himself. He'd reformed systems, but not his heart. He'd been trying to buy redemption with wages and repairs. But what these men needed was something money couldn't purchase. They needed him to actually care. Back in his office, the weight crushed down. He stared at his father's photograph, at those laughing faces, at the warmth he'd never managed to create. I'm not you, he whispered. I can't be what you were. The admission broke something in him. He put his head down on the desk and let the tears come. 5 years of pride, of certainty, of believing his way was better, all of it crumbling into the truth that he'd failed. Failed the mine. Failed the workers. Failed his father's legacy. Failed himself. He didn't hear Eleanor enter. Didn't know she was there until her hand touched his shoulder. I can't do this, he said, voice raw. I'm trying, but I'm not my father. I don't know how to be what he was. Eleanor pulled up a chair, waited until he could look at her. You're right. You're not your father. You're Jonathan Mercer. And you have to find your own way to honor his legacy. Not try to become him. I don't know how. Yes, you do. Her voice was gentle but firm. You've been trying to fix systems. But your father didn't build systems. He built relationships. One person at a time, one conversation at a time, one act of genuine care at a time. She paused. Let that sink in. I lost my husband 3 years ago. Faced a future alone. Terrified I couldn't manage. But William had taught me something that we inherit more than things. We inherit responsibilities, opportunities. The chance to carry forward what mattered to the people who loved us. It took me time to understand that. Time to learn how to embody his faith in people instead of just remembering it. Jonathan wiped his eyes. How did you do it? I stopped trying to be William. Started being Eleanor. Shaped by William's love, but not trying to imitate him. I became a teacher because I believe in shaping the next generation. But I do it my way, not his. She met his eyes. You need to honor your father's principles, but in your own voice. Learn the miners' names, not because Thomas did, but because you genuinely want to know them. Care about their families not out of obligation, but out of real human connection. What if they never believe me? Then you'll have become a better man anyway. Isn't that worth something? Her words settled into the broken places. Jonathan thought about Jimmy, whose name he didn't know, whose baby he'd never acknowledged. Thought about Frank Sullivan's grandchildren. Thought about all the people who were more than numbers on his production reports. Tomorrow, he said slowly, I'm going to start learning names, real families, real lives. Not because it's policy, because they're people. And I want to know them. Eleanor smiled. That's how it begins. Over the next weeks, Jonathan did exactly that. He arrived early, stayed late, talked to every worker he could find, asked about families, remembered details, followed up on previous conversations. It was awkward at first. He fumbled names, forgot details, had to ask the same questions twice. But he kept at it. Discovered that Jimmy was James Morrison, third-generation miner, whose wife Sarah had indeed just delivered a healthy boy. Learned that Frank Sullivan's granddaughter was learning to read. Found out that Tom Bradley's mother was ill and Tom was supporting her. The workers stayed wary. But something shifted. They started answering his questions, started volunteering information. The wall of distrust didn't crumble, but small cracks appeared. Summer deepened. The heat made the mines harder to work, but somehow the atmosphere felt lighter. Jonathan still had far to go, but for the first time, he felt like he was walking the right direction. 3 months after Eleanor brought the letters, Jonathan called a company meeting. Every worker who could attend gathered in the main assembly hall. The foreman looked nervous. The miners looked suspicious. Jonathan stood before them. No podium, no prepared speech. Just a man trying to tell the truth. Most of you knew my father. Some of you worked for him for decades. You remember what this mine was like when Thomas Mercer ran it? He paused. Let that settle. I want to tell you what I've learned in the past 3 months. I inherited this operation 5 years ago and immediately started changing everything my father built. I thought I was improving things. I thought efficiency and profit were what mattered most. I was wrong. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Jonathan pushed forward. My father left letters explaining how to really run this mine, not as a machine for extracting ore, but as a community of people working together. I've been reading those letters. More importantly, I've been trying to live them. The wage increases, the safety improvements, the housing repairs. Those aren't tricks or temporary measures. They're the beginning of rebuilding what I destroyed. He looked across the sea of faces, found Frank Sullivan standing in the back. I know many of you don't trust me. I understand why. Trust is earned through years of consistent action, and I spent 5 years earning your resentment instead. I can't undo that quickly. All I can do is show up, every day, and try to become the kind of man my father was. The kind of man who knows your names, cares about your families, treats you like the human beings you are instead of tools for generating profit. More murmurs. But no one walked out. I'm going to make mistakes. I'm going to forget things, mess up, need to be corrected. But I'm asking for the chance to keep trying. To keep learning, to honor my father's legacy by building the kind of mine he envisioned where people matter more than production numbers, where character creates profit instead of the other way around. Jonathan stopped, waited. The silence stretched like rope under tension. Then Frank Sullivan stepped forward. The old miner's face was weathered as ancient stone, eyes sharp as drill bits. Every man in the room watched him. I didn't believe you at first, Mr. Mercer, Frank said, voice carrying to every corner. Thought this was management games, another way to squeeze more work out of us. But you've shown up every day for 3 months. You learned my grandchildren's names, all 3 of them. You knew when Maggie lost her tooth, when Bobby took his first steps. You asked about my leg, got me to the doctor when I was too stubborn to go myself. The old man's voice roughened. You're not your father, but you're becoming a man he'd be proud of. That's good enough for me, the room erupted. Not in applause, these were miners, not politicians, but in a low rumble of agreement, of acknowledgement, of something that might, eventually, become trust. Another voice rose, then another. Workers sharing similar stories, small kindnesses they'd noticed, questions Jonathan had asked, follow-up conversations that showed he'd actually listened. Tom Bradley stepped up with the quarterly reports. Production's back up to where it was, actually 5% higher, but injury rates are down 40% with the new safety equipment. And housing repair costs were one-time expenses. We're actually saving money long-term with better maintenance. He looked at Jonathan. Turns out your father was right. Profit does follow character. The meeting dissolved into conversations, workers talking to each other, to foreman, to Jonathan himself. The atmosphere had shifted from suspicious to cautiously hopeful. Eleanor watched from the side of the room. Jonathan caught her eye, and she nodded. He made his way to her. I couldn't have done this without you, he said quietly. You brought me my father's words. But more than that, you showed me how to live them. You've been patient when I was slow to understand, honest when I needed truth, believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself. He took a breath, felt his heart hammering. I want to do more than run this mine well. I want to build something that lasts beyond us. Teach these values to the next generation, the miners' children, the community. Create something my father would be proud of. He met her eyes. Eleanor, would you help me build that future, not just as a teacher, but as a partner, as my wife? Eleanor's eyes shone. She didn't answer immediately, just looked at him with that clear, assessing gaze that had seen through all his defenses from the beginning. Yes, she said finally. I'd be honored to build that future with you. Around them, the miners began to notice. Word spread through the hall like fire through dry timber. By the time Jonathan and Eleanor emerged from their quiet corner, the entire company knew. Frank Sullivan raised his lunch pail in salute. To the boss and his lady! The answering cheer shook the rafters. The wedding took place in late August, under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The entire mining community attended. Workers and their families filled every bench in the small church. Children squirmed in Sunday clothes. The smell of fresh bread and roasted meat from the reception tables drifted through open windows. Eleanor walked down the aisle in simple cream, carrying wildflowers the miners' wives had gathered. Jonathan waited at the front, heart full, hands steady for the first time in months. Frank Sullivan stood as his best man. Never thought I'd see the day, the old miner whispered. But your father's smiling down on you, boy. They spoke their vows before God and community. When Jonathan kissed his bride, the church erupted in applause that would have scandalized city folk, but felt perfect here on the frontier. The reception lasted into evening. Jonathan and Eleanor moved through the crowd, greeting everyone, collecting well wishes like treasures. The laughter that had been missing from company gatherings for 5 years rang out freely now. Later, after the cake was cut and the dancing had begun, Jonathan and Eleanor announced their next venture. They stood together at the center of the hall, Jonathan's hand in Eleanor's, and shared their vision. We're establishing the Thomas Mercer School, Eleanor said, her voice clear and strong. Not just for reading and arithmetic, though we'll teach those too, but for teaching character, dignity, responsibility, the values that built this community. Jonathan added, my father believed that profit follows character. We want to ensure the next generation understands what that means, that they learn to value people over productivity, to see work as service to community, to understand that true success is measured in lives touched, not just or extracted. Cheers rose again. Parents nodded, understanding the gift being offered their children. Over the following months, the school took shape in a building Jonathan funded personally. Eleanor led the teaching, but Jonathan participated too, sharing his father's letters, his own hard-learned lessons, the transformation he was still undergoing. Mine owners from neighboring territories started visiting, puzzled by the Copper Canyon operation. Production was high, but the policies seemed counterproductive to pure profit. How do you maintain productivity with all these worker-friendly policies? One asked. Touring the operation, Jonathan smiled. Treat workers like family. Profit follows character, not the reverse. It's not complicated. It's just hard to do if you don't truly believe it. He showed them the injury reports, the production numbers, the worker retention rates. Fear might generate short-term results, but dignity and respect create sustainable success. My father understood that. It took me too long to learn it. But now I know it's true. One afternoon in late September, Jonathan stood at his office window, the same window where this journey had begun 6 months earlier. But everything had changed. Below, workers moved through the yard with purpose and energy. Laughter carried on the autumn air. A group of miners gathered around Frank Sullivan, listening to one of his stories. Children played near the equipment shed while their fathers worked. The office itself had transformed. Photographs lined the walls, now company picnics. The Christmas celebration they'd reinstated. Families Jonathan had come to know and care about. The harsh lamplight had been replaced with warmer fixtures. Eleanor's teaching books shared shelf space with mining reports. On his desk, beside the leather satchel that had started everything, sat a new journal. Jonathan was writing his own letters now. Wisdom for future generations. Lessons learned through failure and redemption. The ongoing story of what it meant to inherit more than property, to inherit responsibility. Purpose. Legacy. Eleanor appeared in the doorway, smiled at him. Ready to go? Frank's granddaughter is reading at the school today. She wants you to hear. Wouldn't miss it. Jonathan crossed to her, took her hand. Together they walked out of the office, leaving the door open behind them. As they crossed the yard, workers called greetings. Jonathan knew every name now, every family story, every struggle and triumph. They'd stopped hating him months ago. Now, slowly but surely, they were learning to respect him, not because he was Thomas Mercer's son, because he was Jonathan Mercer, finding his own way to honor his father's legacy. That evening, sitting in the school watching little Maggie Sullivan sound out words from her primer, Jonathan understood what his father had really left him. Not mines or equipment or production systems. The true inheritance was this: the knowledge that character matters more than profit, that people matter more than efficiency. That legacy is measured in lives touched and dignity preserved. He'd spent 5 years building an empire on money, but his father had built one on character. And now, finally, Jonathan was learning to do the same. Eleanor caught his eye across the room, smiled that quiet smile that had guided him through transformation. Tomorrow they'd continue the work, teaching, leading, building. But tonight, surrounded by community and purpose and earned respect, Jonathan felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. His father's letters had shown him the way. Eleanor's wisdom had helped him walk it. The workers' gradual trust had confirmed he was on the right path. The legacy wasn't just redeemed, it was alive, growing, continuing into the next generation. And that, Jonathan understood at last, was what inheritance really meant.